So finally, the long silence has been broken. The Duskbloods was first revealed as a brand new IP from FromSoftware during the early promotion cycle for the Nintendo Switch 2. Directed by Hidetaka Miyazaki, the project immediately drew attention due to its mysterious presentation, gothic tone, and apparent departure from traditional Souls-like structure. After its initial reveal, however, communication around the game went almost completely quiet for nearly a full year, with no major gameplay showcases, developer updates, or deep dives into its systems. Finally, that silence has now been broken with the new Nintendo presentation confirming that the Duskbloods is still actively in development and has reached a stage where public testing is possible. A closed network test has officially been announced, signaling that core systems such as online infrastructure, combat balance, and multiplayer functionality are now being stress tested ahead of launch. Now, mind you, I am relatively new when it comes to the From Software and the Souls-like community. Elden Ring was my very first game, the very first installment that I've ever played by FromSoft. I didn't even know about the IP and about the games that they created until that game came out. That game was so heavily marketed, so well marketed, and so popularized. I'm like, okay, what is the hype behind Elden Ring? And then I played it, and then I've put over 1,000 hours into it by now. So I wish I could say that a full year of silence seems like it's uncharacteristic of From Software, but in truth, I don't know. So all I have to go off of is my own speculation of what I think is right and what I think is wrong. And I think that a long time is definitely defined by that full year that we didn't have any information about the Duskbloods. It almost felt like the game vanished after its announcement because it was announced at that Nintendo Direct. I think it was sometime last year. Well, obviously it was last year because it's been a full year of silence, but it was last year when that Nintendo Direct came out where it teased this, and it was a 3-minute trailer. And in that trailer, we saw an abundance of different things upon which YouTubers had a field day with it, but then we just had a year of radio silence thereafter. So I'm just glad that the network test coming out, it confirms that they're much more further ahead than we anticipated. Because, I think one of the biggest concerns is that we would expect them to have stalled production or stalled development of the game because they aren't communicating with us and they aren't telling us anything. But I guess no news is good news in this case because they are working hard and we're nearing a point in time where we can finally get our hands on the game. So this is the first real proof of life we've had in a while. So what is this game? For those of you who don't know who haven't even heard of it, you'd have to be living under a rock by this point, but the Duskbloods is described as a multiplayer-focused PvPvE action game set in a dark gothic fantasy world. So the usual Souls-like type games is made by FromSoft. So players take on the role of beings known as the Bloodsworn, characters that are empowered through blood-based abilities and transformations. Matches appear to involve up to 8 players simultaneously, combining cooperative survival against environmental threats with competitive combat between players. The game's world blends gothic architecture, supernatural horror, and subtle technological elements, creating a setting that feels both ancient and slightly industrialized at the same time. Gameplay emphasizes fast movement, aggressive combat, and the use of unique blood abilities that distinguish it from Software's more traditional stamina-based systems. So here's an alert, I'm about to say something blasphemous. I've never played Bloodborne. I literally have it in my digital library, but I've never played it. I was hoping and kind of waiting for them to put out a PS5 version of the game so I can enjoy it that way, because like I said, Elden Ring was my first introduction into From Software. So I was just holding out hope that they would remaster Bloodborne so I can enjoy it on the PS5. I don't think that's going to happen, so I eventually probably have to play Bloodborne. But I say all that to say, I use that prefacing to state that the aesthetic of this game, it looks like it's heavily inspired by Bloodborne, despite the fact that I've never played Bloodborne. Just from looking at the images on the PlayStation Store, looking at the cover, looking at the backdrop, looking at the characters, looking at the story, it kind of is reminiscent of Bloodborne. I think that the Duskbloods is kind of reminiscent of that, and I think the mix of magic, of blood powers, and of tech is pretty unusual for From Software based on what I've seen, because aside from Elden Ring, I haven't played Bloodborne, but I have played the original Dark Souls. I haven't played 2 or 3, but I played the original one. And based on the aesthetics and the feel that I get from the initial Dark Souls and even the latter 2 that I haven't played, they don't seem to strike me as something that will dabble heavily into blood-based abilities or technology or industrialization, because with the Duskbloods, it seems more like it's vampirism, like it's based on a vampire type of blood-based foundation for the game, whereas in Bloodborne, obviously blood is a premise, and obviously in Elden Ring, you have blood incantations from Lord Moog, that type of stuff, but it doesn't seem as an heavily It doesn't seem like it's the usual MO for From Software. It still feels like it's hard to fully understand from trailers alone about the true identity and the true, I guess, feel for this game. And this could either be incredibly deep or it could be intentionally vague marketing. With From Software, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Who knows? I would argue it's probably more intentionally vague. And if it's not intentionally vague, they know that they have a loyal audience and people are going to pick it up and play it regardless, just based on how the aesthetic looks and on the small remnants and fragments of gameplay that we have able to have watched during these trailers. Let's talk about the multiplayer feature of the game. So unlike traditional From Software titles, the Duskbloods is built around multiplayer interaction from the ground up. As I stated earlier, the PvPvE structure, this means that players are not only fighting AI-controlled enemies, but also competing directly against each other for objectives and for survival. Matches are structured around evolving objectives that reward both cooperation and betrayal depending on player decisions. This design places the game closer to modern extraction-style multiplayer experiences than to classic Soulsborne campaigns. It also follows a recent pattern of From Software experimenting with multiplayer-driven titles, alongside other recent projects that emphasize shared world or cooperative systems, games like Night Rain. Now, me specifically, I don't like these type of games. I don't like online service player games. I don't like games where you're playing with other people. I don't like multiplayer games. That's just not me. I'm a single player narrative driven gamer. That's me. That's my thing. So even with a game like Elden Ring, it's single player. I would argue that's narrative driven. It's not just, the story just isn't told in a traditionally single player narrative sense because it's fragmented and you usually find out about the goings on and what transpired in the lands between via interactions with NPCs. I would argue that's still narrative driven and everything is centered around the aftermath of the shattering. Whereas in Night Rain and from what it appears to be in this game, this is more multiplayer based. This is based on cooperation with other players, coming together to take down bosses. Yeah, that's all fun and dandy, but there are just some people like me, who don't like those type of games. And it's fine if you do like those type of games. They're experimenting. They're seeing what gamers like. They're testing the waters. There are going to be a subset of people who, where the majority or where a lion's share may not like these type of games, it's going to be a small subset who really enjoy it. And that's exactly what we saw with Night Rain, where those people really loved the game and they played on repeat. Now, I, for one, may be judging it too harshly. I've only played it for maybe not even a couple hours, but I just knew right away this isn't the type of game that I myself like. And we all like different things. So this is where my interest, it immediately drops substantially because I just don't want to play it. But when it comes to the Duskbloods, the fact that I saw PvPvE, it will allows me to believe maybe they might do some sort of single player component to the game, since it's still player versus environment. It's not that predominantly, but it's still a component of the game. So I'm kind of trying to maintain some wishful thinking to see if they'll provide something for us single player guys. I highly doubt it, but we'll see. And I'll just wait primarily for gameplay, for reviews. I know the reviews are going to be good, but for just the general reception to the game and just see if there are any single player components to it. If there is, I'll pick it up, but if not, then I just won't get it, which is fine. Now, From Software, they're clearly experimenting, but it's not what I would usually want from them, but it's what they themselves want to do. And that's all I respect, is that they themselves, as the developer, they're making an executive decision. They're saying, okay, we know that the majority of the people who play Souls games, they like these single player experiences. Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, Elden Ring, all that stuff. However, we're going to experiment. We're going to see what can become of this. We're going to test the waters. And I don't blame anybody for that, because you're bold, you're trying something new, where we live in a time where a lot of gamers, they like to prioritize comfortability, and comfortability does not lead to growth or to innovation at all. So FromSoftware's leadership, including Miyazaki, has stated in previous discussions around similar projects that experimental multiplayer titles do not replace their commitment to single player experiences. That's all the confirmation I need. The studio continues to develop traditional narrative-driven games alongside these experimental projects. The Duskbloods appears to be positioned as a test bed for new systems rather than a full replacement of the Soulsborne formula. Elements such as faster traversal, expanded movement systems, and large-scale online interactions may serve as experimentation that could influence future titles without defining the studio's entire direction. So, not only does this feel more like an experiment than a permanent shift, but they actually explicitly just said that. Miyazaki, I remember when the game was first announced last year, when that Nintendo Direct came out, he had an interview. I think it was actually posted on Nintendo's website for the Duskbloods. Miyazaki was interviewed by someone from Nintendo or some sort of gaming representative, and they were speaking in depth about the Duskbloods, and he himself in that interview said, this will not replace the titles that we want to do. We're still going to do single player based games like Elden Ring, like Dark Souls, etc. Fans were likely worried that this was the new direction for FromSoft, which is why you not only see people expressing their hate and their disregard and dislike for a multiplayer title, but why they continue and persistently do so a year later, because they may think that FromSoft is going to continue doing this and this is going to become the new MO, especially after the Duskbloods is releasing fresh off of Night Rain, which also had a similar structure, a multiplayer type of game. Single player identity is still what defines them, and Miyazaki himself has said this is still what defines them. The real value may be what future games borrow from this. I made a video last week, a couple weeks ago, but it came out last week, pertaining to God of War Lao Fei, and how people were complaining about how Lao Fei having her own game may be kind of replacing Kratos, but that's not what it is. All it is just an essential component of Kratos' story. It's sort of like a spin-off, just starring his wife. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they're still going to make Kratos-driven, Kratos-based narratives and games in the future. And the mechanics introduced in God of War Lao Fei can serve as foreshadowing as to what happens in Kratos' next adventure. I think that's all the Duskbloods could be for future single-player titles for FromSoftware as well. It could serve as a basis as to what we may likely see in the future. Now, in terms of the Duskbloods' gameplay identity and what makes it stand out, the Duskbloods introduces a noticeably faster and more mobile combat system compared to previous FromSoftware titles. Players are shown utilizing rapid dashes, aerial movement options, and range combat tools that significantly increase combat speed and verticality. Blood-based abilities appear to function as both offensive mechanics and mobility enhancements, allowing for dynamic mid-fight adaptations. The overall structure suggests a shift towards shorter, more intense match-based encounters rather than long-form exploration. Environmental design also appears more compact and encounter-driven, reinforcing the multiplayer loop. So the combat, it looks way faster and more sleek than Elden Ring and Dark Souls was. It almost feels closer to a Bloodborne on steroids. And mind you, like I said, I haven't played Bloodborne, but just based on how Bloodborne looks in the overall aesthetic of the game, I would imagine that it's a much more compact, much more intimate setting where it prioritizes those fast-paced encounters as opposed to just those long, grueling boss fights or large, incredible worlds upon which it encourages more exploration. The movement system, it might be one of the most interesting parts of the game, and I'm just more so excited to see more reveals pertaining to the combat and the gameplay itself as opposed to the multiplayer functionality of it, because I don't really like that component of it. A closed network test for this game has been officially announced for this summer. This test will allow selected players to experience early builds of the game's multiplayer systems, including matchmaking, combat balance, server stability, and core gameplay loops. These tests are typically used by FromSoftware to refine online performance and identify issues before full release. Since the network test is so close, a release window is probably becoming more concrete. Man, this is the biggest update we've had in almost an entire year since the game was initially announced and teased. And a network test, it usually confirms that the game is relatively far along in the developmental and production process. At least that's the impression that I would get from it. You're ready for people to start playtesting and deciding if the game has a build of passing skill. So I think they're generally far along and that we may be nearing a release date for this game, a release date announcement, because they're still sticking to the release date, the release window for 2026. So we're still going to get it this year according to them. So we'll see more information and we'll have more of a firm and concrete opinion about the game once we have this network test. And at least we know that that's coming up soon. We'll have it before the end of August because it says summer of this year. So I know for certain I will be watching Fighting Cowboy stream the network test so I can see how the game runs, so I can see the gameplay, and I myself can have answers to the questions of whether there will be single player components to this game as opposed to just a strict online multiplayer experience, which would probably be which would definitely be a deal breaker for me. So this could massively shift the public perception depending on the feedback, and if it lands well, hype will spike pretty quickly. So this game, it kind of represents a new direction for FromSoftware as a studio with the focus of this PvPvE, which I've never seen them do before. I've never seen any other game do that before either, but that could be because I'm living under a rock when it comes to multiplayer type titles. And then with the network tests are officially scheduled for summer of this year. Even though we don't have the date, we have the release window. The game is steadily moving closer and closer to launch, and for us to have more information as gamers and people who are actively anticipating the release of this title. So I was initially surprised by this game's direction, because I was really hoping that when I heard that the Nintendo Switch 2 system was getting a From Software title, that it would be something that was single player based. Multiplayer isn't what I look for. It isn't what I like to play when it comes to From Software, but I get that they're diversifying and they're being innovative, which is a good characteristic for a game developer to have. It still has strong visual and mechanical appeal, despite that I don't like the multiplayer aspect of the game. I think the real question is whether this becomes more of a blueprint or just a side experiment for them to see how things will go, or how this could affect their single player titles. So I guess, is the Duskbloods the beginning of a new From Software era, or just an experimental debut before the next single player adventure? I'm Harlem. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.